Today we have a remarkable guest. He is a professor at the New School, and Mr. Sean Jacobs. Thank you very much for coming, Sean.
Thank you very much.
He teaches media and international affairs at the New School. So let me give you a brief information about him. Mr. Jacobs, he's a native of Cape Town, South Africa. He holds his PhD in politics from the University of London and a MA in political science from Northwestern University. He is working on a book on the intersection of mass media, globalization, and liberal democracy in post-apartheid South Africa. He is also co-editor of Thabo Mbeki's World, the politics and ideology of South African presidents. And also you are working on 2 different books. And his most recent scholarly articles have appeared in Politique Africana, right? In 2006. And today what we will discuss is the new media. I mean, what is the distinction between the new media and the old media, and how these new mediums affect the international politics, particularly. So my first question, Professor Jacobs, how can we describe the new media, and what is the distinction between the new media and the old media? As you know, Marshall McLuhan had an interesting phrase like, medium is the message. So what do you think the message of the new medium, the new media, is?
Well, I think the best way to think about new media, firstly, is what it is. I think there is a lot of hyperbole. In other words, people overstate its effect, not just for how we communicate, but also for its impact on politics. And let me just for a moment backtrack.
Please.
So there is this argument that we've, in terms of sort of popular media as it developed over the last 100 years, we've had the development of professional media, this idea that, particularly in the United States, in the 1920s, you see the emergence of journalism schools. You had, by the 1960s, so the idea that a newspaper is less partisan than it used to be. In other words, it's not picking sides anymore. It's just there to produce the news. By the 1970s, of course, 1960s, you have the emergence of this kind of new journalism, which is to tell stories. This is, in popular terms, this kind of Hunter S. Thompson, Tom Wolfe. You have by the early 1970s in the US, again, kind of, it's not really, it's the same press, but they're more activist. They're not picking sides, but they would like to uncover secrets, particularly the secrets of governments. So this is the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate scandal, and also the emergence of these kind of personality journalists, Seymour Hersh, Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, etc. So at this point still, this small community controls what we read, or it's not that they're nefarious, but it's the way that things are structured. So there's a community of people, particularly still print. Television is kind of emerging as a medium by which we communicate and which we talk politics. What happens by the 1990s, we see the emergence of cable television, and now there's a free-for-all. There's the return of kind of partisan. Initially, CNN doesn't do that, but Fox kind of, creates this kind of era for us. Mm-hmm. We can debate about CNN later on, but the point is, it's really Fox that does that. But simultaneously, around that time, technology changes. Mm-hmm. And the technological change does a number of things, right? It decenters, so we don't have these people just communicating to us anymore. We can now talk back to them. There's a very interesting article that appeared in the New York Times about 2 years ago by its correspondent in India. And at the one end, he was merely reporting that if you try to interview somebody in India now, they can actually read what you're writing about them. In the past, if you wrote something about them, they had to wait a couple of days for the newspaper to arrive at the local embassy or the US Information Service. or at the local embassy, they'd read the newspaper, and by the time they would like to respond to you, it's 3 weeks later. If they responded, the letter may or may not appear in the paper. But now what happens, the moment you write, it goes online, and now you have a constituency not just in the United States, but you also have a constituency in India. At the same time, though, he was sort of incredulous. He was like, okay, this means that I can't just say things anymore that he was also sort of lamenting the fact that this was changing for him, that he couldn't get away with stuff. So I think that's one change of this, of the emergence of new media, which is this media that, of course, the second generation is what we're talking about now, Facebook, Twitter, and I'll say something about that in a minute.
Yes.
But its first generation was just to take online what had been offline. I remember in 1995 when the internet became a sort of popular medium, when you began to see these crude websites of mainly the existing media kind of migrating to the internet, and then sort of over time the weblogs, that became blogs, started to emerge like in the late 90s, maybe mostly like journalists who were frustrated with journalism, and then gradually by sort of the beginnings of the 2000s, you saw people in this sort of stereotypical terms in their basement beginning to write about whether it's domestic policy, but increasingly about politics that's happening outside the United States, and educating people inside the US about it. So there is this, it's instantaneous, there's an element of commenting directly. It's definitely democratic. It has increased the number of voices that we hear about a particular topic. There's Michael Massing at Columbia University wrote this piece about how it also helps with specialization. So if you're interested in a particular kind of topic, let's say you're interested in tracking developments in Iraq, or tracking developments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or peace process, there are a number of websites that you can go to. So you now can, you can read, what's his name, Jeffrey at the Atlantic Monthly, Jeffrey Goldberg. You can read Juan Cole at Michigan, where I used to work. You can read Haaretz, like the Israeli newspaper. You can read it now online. So what it's done is it's available, but it's also meant that there's some kind of specialization going on. The trouble with that, unfortunately, is now those people are only reading within that kind of small set of voices that they're working with. What the second part of it, and I'll shut up about this because I think you have other questions, is what has also happened with the second generation of this kind of new media, and this is the emergence, of course, and I don't have to bore you with this, of social media, Facebook, especially Facebook and Twitter. There's been a bunch of other new media, social media that emerged since the late 90s. Many of them don't exist anymore. The first one was called 6 Degrees. I mean, it's sort of based on the idea of 6 degrees of separation. There were Friendster, etc., but these were mostly for young people, to sort of hang around, see pictures of your friends. But Facebook, initially starting as a college-based web presence or social media tool, quickly transformed, and that happened really quickly from sort of, they opened it up to the general public, if you want, but first to high school students, and then you found that your older brother or your mother, and perhaps most of us here in this room, are in Facebook. And so, yes, Facebook is trivial, but Facebook also began to serve another function, which is now you may not even go to those, if you're caring about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or about Iraq, you're not even going every day to go read Jeffrey Goldberg on a blog. You waiting for a friend of yours who is sort of updating his or her status and saying, Jeffrey Goldberg has a piece in the Atlantic Monthly, or Juan Cole has a piece, or et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I think has happened, is that where we find our news, that small group of people that I described earlier, they don't have so much a control over what we read or how we read it. We're still reading very much what they're writing, but we're reading it sort of on our own terms, and we're also reading it alongside a number of other sources. And then the final point I want to make is, beyond just reading, new media also sort of has not so much created, but it's enabled people also to organize politically. So there's this argument, and I know that it's often overstated, that new media plays a role in organizing people in in what was called the first Twitter revolution. This is what was in Moldova in 2005. Then there's the argument, the similar argument was made about Iran last year. So, and this is the biggest one was, of course, here in the United States with the election of Barack Obama. Again, these, particularly in the cases of Iran and Moldova, these things are overstated. I mean, there's been research that show inside Iran, it was a very small group of bloggers who were blogging, who were Twittering. Their things got picked up outside Iran and then gets retweeted. So what we think is like millions of Iranians tweeting is the work of often like a very small group of people whose work gets spread around the world. And then the second element of it is there's also other tweeting going on in Farsi. I mean, this idea that there's only people doing it in English, and so people overstate often like certain events, or they're not understanding that the government is also organizing. They also know about the internet. They also understand, in this case, the government of Iran. So there's a way in which these things get overstated, in which we make assumptions that everybody is on Twitter, everybody's on Facebook, but these are very small groups of people.
Right.
It's particularly in the West, and even more so, particularly in the United States. In Britain, the recent election of David Cameron was the first election where bloggers played a key role in the election. There's a blogger called Guy Fawkes, and you can see where that's going, who has become the most prominent blogger in England, but only with this election. British politicians are, pretending that they're using Twitter. So I have a Twitter account, it's a sort of like I'm tweeting, but they're not really using it in the way that I think has been used in American politics yet. I think when we talk about new media, we often overstate what I think is still very much something that's limited to the first world, and if it's in developing countries, if it's in developing states, it's very much to a very small
Right.
set of elites. Yeah.
Just last week, I remember that an Iranian blogger was sentenced for 20 years, right? So is there any media activism about that issue?
I mean, I saw it. This shows you my reading habits. I saw it on Gawker. I don't know if you know Gawker. This is a media gossip website that's based in New York City. And I remember they were, when I opened the morning when I opened a couple of sites that I check daily, I saw that the Iranian activists have been sentenced, I think, up to like, was it 16 or 17?
Well, I think he was sentenced for 19 years or 20 years, yeah.
I think
because of his bloggings. Yeah.
Right.
He was living in Canada, I think.
Right, so and he went to Iran and he got arrested, yeah. I think the issue once again is